We're joined today by Professor Damani Partridge, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Afroamerican and African Studies in the University of Michigan. Thank you very much for this interview, Professor.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we've been following, and the world is following, and in India there's tremendous interest for various reasons about the protests, the Black Lives Matters protest all over the US, and now it has spread to UK, Europe, etc. There have been killings by the police of blacks and African Americans in the past. They're pulled out. There's extra policing and very, very harsh policing. And yet, the outburst we've seen in this particular case of George Floyd, who was killed by police officers in Minneapolis, seems somehow different. Is that so?
I think so. I mean, there's been a repeated history of police violence and popular violence against African American men and women. I think what's particularly different this time is both that it was, not even that it was recorded, but that it was, I think people talk about the angle of the recording, the fact that you could see the callousness of the police officer, kind of a casual killing. And then also the response has been quite different in the sense that there have been a real coalition of people of color, of white Americans, of young people marching in all cities, all over the country and all over the world. So I think that simultaneity of the protest is part of a response that I think is different.
Professor, the protesters have come out, despite there being a pandemic, despite there being social distancing. So clearly the anger is very, very real, and the energy is there that they're ready to take these risks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not in spite of. I mean, I think their awareness that the pandemic is there. People are wearing masks at the protests, but people have talked about it as two pandemics. There's a pandemic of racial violence persistence, and there's a pandemic of COVID, right? And so these are intersecting, and hopefully leading to a different kind of possibility for a different kind of future.
Could it be also that there is a lot of frustration that has bubbled over because of the lockdown, because the fact that African Americans are dying disproportionately in the pandemic, the political context, you have a very, very insensitive president who could all that have played a role? People are also losing jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done a study, so I'm sure that plays a role, but I don't know how much a role it plays. I mean, I'm sure the fact that that Black people are dying disproportionately as a result of COVID, that plays a role, that people feel as if they're not being cared for in the same way as the rest of the population. I'm sure that plays a role.
Yeah. It started in Minneapolis and it moved rapidly to New York and other places. And those who say that these protests are valid, but they shouldn't be vandalism, and they shouldn't be, shop fronts being demolished. I saw a video somewhere in which this person goes out and shows various shops apparently looted. Does that take away from the thrust of what the protests are all about? And is there coverage of all that by the media and the administrations, the various administrations?
I think initially in the U.S., I mean, I've heard a little bit about the Indian discussion, that the Indian discussion is focused on vandalism and looting, and instead of thinking about the whole event as part of a protest. Trevor Noah, who's a daily night host here in the U.S. and I think also is seen around the world, made an argument that I think is quite valid, that when the social contract is broken, when you see a police person callously murdering someone, then how do you know which part of the law should be upheld, which part should be broken? I mean, how are people supposed to be part of society when they can be killed by the people who are supposed to protect them? Furthermore, I'm not sure that it's clear exactly who's doing. It's not one group of people who are breaking into stores or taking things. On the other hand, I mean, why should private property be valued more than human life? And I think that's the thrust of the protest. The thrust of the protest is to say that Black lives also matter, Black lives matter, that Black lives should be valued, that Black lives should be protected, that Black lives should be cared for. And I think that's the central message. And I think the focus on breaking buildings or breaking windows or breaking into stores is a distraction. I think not necessarily by the protesters, but by the people who focus on that.
Yeah, of course. There's also I've also read about how troublemakers have got in and who have tried to take advantage of this, perhaps to obfuscate the issues deliberately, but also they may be just troublemakers and vandals.
Yeah, it's not clear, but I mean, either way, I think we can't forget the fact that the center of the protest and the center of the problematic is one in which Black lives are not valued. There's a long history of that or devaluation or lack of valuing and lack of care, and that needs to remain at the center, I think. And I think people around the world get that. I mean, I think that's why so many people are marching in Berlin and Australia and in South Korea and all over the world.
Interestingly, while you say that, I must say I just read about it in Canada, that protests were held in Canada, which is your neighboring country, but South Korea so far. But there have been no protests done in India. And I did think about that. And I have a couple of ideas. But it's really intriguing that some countries have come forward, and South Korea is a very good example, which has very little kind of direct ties with the West, and yet people have made their voice heard.
Well, I mean, there was the Korean War, right? I mean, which is still an ongoing conflict between North and South Korea, and that there were American troops placed in Korea. So I'm not sure to what extent that plays a role, but clearly there's a global dynamic happening here. And I'm not sure, I mean, it's curious to me that there aren't protests in India. Given sort of the early coalition between, for example, Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, or Martin Luther King learning from Mahatma Gandhi's strategies of civil disobedience. So, I mean, it's curious to me that it's not also happening in India.
Yeah. Now, some of the things that have been suggested as solutions, as it were, or the protesters have turned around and said this, and there is a lot of talk about that now, is the question of defunding the police. Now, that's something that we can't fully understand here, though I read somewhere, I think AOC has said that just get your head around the budget for the New York police, and it's been nominal compared to even some states. What exactly is it, and how could it be implemented, and how could it help, if at all?
Defunding the police?
Yes. If you could kind of break it down for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the US has proportionally the most imprisoned people of anywhere in the world. So there's a problem there. I think since the 70s, I read a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post, sorry, that says since the 70s, there's been a massive increase in police funding and a massive decrease in the funding for social services. So I think what those protests are calling for is a redirection of that funding. I mean, the police are being called to do things that they shouldn't be doing. I mean, that they're being called to solve problems that guns can't solve. Even, situations like domestic violence would be perhaps much better engaged through social service strategies, through thinking about income inequality, through thinking about mental health, which was also massively defunded, under the Reagan administration. So I think that defunding the police is about thinking about caring for the population as opposed to policing the population.
And do you think it will help? What's your own view on it?
Do I think what will help?
And how will it be done?
Defunding the police?
Yeah, because administrations don't just switch off things that have been going on for a lot of time, and it's going to require a complete change of thinking, leave alone strategy. Do you think that can happen?
Well, I think there are existing models around the world. I just read an article about how in Norway, how they haven't killed a person in 10 years. The police have not killed a person in 10 years in Norway. There's a case of Camden, New Jersey has already changed their funding of the police. So I think there are examples that and models that can be followed to think about how the funding can be redirected, the forms of managing violence can be redirected. Because obviously some groups are experiencing massive violence from the state, from local, federal administrations. And so clearly that needs to be changed.
And that cuts across demographics, classes, economic segmentations. It can happen to anybody, right? It's not.
It cuts across class and demographics, but disproportionately, it's Black and Brown people are suffering at the result.
Oh, I mean, within Black and Brown, it cuts across.
Oh yes, exactly. That's definitely true. Yeah, I mean, but clearly, even there, I'm sure that people who are some people experience more violence, right? Who are in situations that are where there's more policing.
What are the conversations that are happening among those who are not necessarily out in protests in the academic community? I know this is a vast question, so there's no way to kind of generalize. But generally, what kind of conversations while you're locked in are you having with your colleagues, with not necessarily African Americans, with people within the community, within the Blacks? What are the conversations, some of the conversations you've been hearing?
In the anthropology department, for example, we've been having a whole series of discussions that started earlier this year, actually a couple of years ago, but they've intensified this year around inclusion in the department. And now we're going to have, not this week, but next week, we're going to have a discussion about anti-Black racism and white supremacy. So I think the protests are leading to the possibilities for a kind of discussion that ordinarily wouldn't happen in that way. I don't think that I haven't heard any explicit discussion of white supremacy as part of a department discussion until now. So I think that the protests are leading to that new kind of possibility to think about, how are students of color affected by the regular policies of the department. So I think it's thinking about pay, who gets paid how much, thinking about trajectories, what are the possibilities for people to be employed, depending on their skin color and their background in terms of having parents who've been in the academy or not. So those are the kinds of discussions that we have had, but I think the nature of those discussions is intensified as a result of the protests.
Meanwhile, while on the subject of white supremacy and other related issues, how do you see the pulling down of the statue in Bristol of a slave trader?
I think it's quite good. I've seen some debates about that. Obviously, there have been long debates about monuments, but I think one of the questions is whose space is this, and who has a right to make decisions in this space. I think previously the discussions around monuments, like the Roads Must Fall discussion in South Africa, for example, have been an affront to people who feel as if they're entering these spaces that used to be white spaces or should no longer be white spaces, but they're being saying those kind of monuments are a monument to the kind of establishment of these spaces as white spaces. And so that needs to be changed. And I think when people saw, at least when I saw the monument being toppled and pushed into the water, one has a sense that something has changed and there's a kind of new possibility for this to be space also for people of color.
And the same thing has happened in a few parts of the US where Columbus statues have been brought down.
Columbus and Robert E. Lee statues. So I think that's also links sort of what the local situation to a global situation, which I think is also important. It creates a possibility of a different kind of conversation beyond the nation state.
Now, the bigger question, of course, that one must look at in America right now is that not just a local police station, but on a different level, you have a president who is extremely insensitive about these matters, and the manner in which he has spoken out without reaching out to citizens, especially Black citizens, the manner in which he has mocked everyone. The way he marched across to the church, which he has not gone to ever, and the police are the military outside, the military response to contain protesters. Does the fact of somebody like President Trump as the president affect what's happening, and is in a way adding fuel to the fire, but a little more than that politically?
I'm sure it affects what's happening. I remember at the University of Michigan, right after Trump was elected, there were immediately protests. So I think I'm sure also COVID-19, as we discussed, is also affecting what's happening in the sense that because of the disproportionate effect of that. I mean, of the disease on certain populations, it sort of reveals something about the society that one might not otherwise see so clearly. I think so. The combination of the violence of the disease and the violence of the police and the violence of Trump leads to the kind of outrage that gets people marching, gets people on the street.
But what do you think of the fact that here's a president who says, who threatens that he's going to call out call out military forces against his own people? Would a better president have handled the situation in a
Well, clearly, it's bordering on sort of the dissolution of any pretense of democracy.
Yes, for us, it's got a particular resonance because the United States has been a very old democracy, and B, we too are facing threats to the democratic order. So I wonder whether this is. I know this is hardly a subject we need to go into at this stage, but I really wonder whether it's part of some kind of global changeover where Democrats have begun, democratically elected lawmakers have begun, officials have begun to behave like dictators.
I think there's a global trend towards populism. I mean, in Europe, in Asia, in the U.S. I mean, and not just in the U.S., also in South America. So hopefully, I mean, I don't know, but hopefully this will lead to a new direction.
But whatever he does is a dog whistle to his supporters, who are also large in number.
Sorry, I missed the last part of what you said.
Sorry?
I just didn't hear the last part of what you were saying.
Yeah, so I was saying that what he says, what he does, his bluster, his threats, they're dog whistle to his followers, and they're a large number of followers and supporters.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, clearly he knows what he's doing in terms of the rhetoric. Clearly, it brings people out. It brings, and it's dangerous. I mean, in Michigan, where I live, in the state capital, there around COVID-19, a group of people came out saying that they should open everything up with guns, and they also brought Confederate flags and nooses and sort of white supremacy with them. So clearly, there's a link. And Trump said that they were good people. So I mean, clearly there's a problem and a link between what he's saying and what his supporters are doing. But I think there's also a link to what the rest of the world, how the rest of the world is responding as well.
Now, finally, we kind of look at the future. Where do you think all these protests will lead in terms of not merely changing the discussion around it, but also changing laws, also changing institutional biases, real change? Where do you think all this will lead? You see positive outcomes?
I think some of the changes already started. I mean, in Minneapolis, they already voted to defund the police. I mean, how that happens in practice, we will see. Clearly, though, I mean, as we've seen from past examples, the activism will need to be persistent in order for a real change, in order for persistent, long-term, durable change to happen.
And you think there is hope that it will change? Do the protesters feel that they won't go back to their homes in vain after having done all this?
Well, I cannot speak for all the protests. I mean, but I mean, they're daily marches. So I think people have the energy and persistence that's necessary to make, at least to make politicians, universities, industries realize that something has to change. I mean, I think it's amazing, whether they're superficial or not. It's amazing that so many groups and organizations have come out making statements in support of the protests and against anti-Black violence, against the systematic racism. I think that shows that there's an awareness that things have to change. I think people have to keep pushing in order for that to actually happen.
Yeah, so this is going to be, in some respects, a milestone in the the way the future unfolds. It's going to be something that people look back on and say, yes, this happened, and therefore it led to this.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Damani Partridge. This was quite helpful, especially to our viewers who are trying to make sense of what's going on. Once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.